So tonight, we are handling, we're going to talk through one of the, you could use a lot of words here, one of the most popular, one of the most common, one of the most challenging, one of the most existential, one of the most personal questions for anybody that is wrestling with faith, belief in God, participation in the church, believing in Christianity, trust in the Bible. And it's been called a lot of different things. The most succinctly, maybe you've heard of the phrase, the problem of evil, or the problem from evil. I think the way that we talked about it over social media over the past couple of weeks leading up to tonight is if a loving God exists, if any God exists, why would he allow so much evil and suffering in the world? And first off, I want to say this. Hang in there with me tonight. It's a big question. And when we look at all the terrible examples of suffering that are in the world as well as in our own lives, I'm willing to bet that our primary concern isn't a rational one. It's an emotional one. And sure, we want to be able to square logically with how a good God can exist and be over a world that has so much messed up brokenness and destruction and suffering in it. We want to square that intellectually, but also experientially, that doesn't solve the problem of the crisis we're dealing with our own lives, of the loss that we've experienced, of we just look at the headlines any given day, the world that's going on around us. And so we might ask, how could God allow this person to die, or this accident to happen, or this natural disaster to occur? And those are like real questions. But in all honesty, we're not just looking to be okay with it intellectually. Deep down, and I say this personally as well, deep down, we wish it wouldn't have happened. We don't just want to understand that it's okay, it makes sense that it's allowed to happen. Why did it happen? Why did it have to happen? Did it have to happen? Can it not happen going forward? Those are the kind of things that we would want to bring to a God that the Bible is going to say is able to do something about it. We want to feel peace instead of fear, joy instead of sorrow. And so tonight we're going to start off addressing the problem of evil using our heads. But I told you, stick with me, because I promise you we're going to use that discussion to ultimately get us to where we all want to go, speaking to our hearts. Because the only way that I can commend Christianity to you as a pastor and as a follower of Jesus is that I'm inviting you into a holistic relationship with a loving God who can holistically shape, strengthen, and sustain every aspect of your life. That's what I believe the Bible teaches. That's what we want to stand on as a new church here on the North Shore. And so that is the way that we're going to approach this question tonight. And so with that, we're going to be jumping around in a lot of different places tonight. And I wish that I'd have some quotes for you on screen, but that means now you just have to lean in and listen all the more intently. Or we'll also be in our Bibles in various passages. If you need a Bible, if you don't own one, you can lift up a hand and somebody will get you a copy. We have some free ones in the back corner. Also, you can feel free to use on your app, but we're going to be diving into a bunch of different places tonight. And where we're going to start is with this fundamental question: what is evil? Because regardless of our different backgrounds or perspectives, I think we can all agree that things are not how they should be in the world. They're not how we would want them to be. A quick glance at the news just this very week makes that very clear. To me, it seems that something has gone wrong. And that's an important foundation for understanding the Bible's definition of evil. If you go to the book of Jeremiah, written by the prophet in the Old Testament, Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 13, says, God says, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. So what does he mean by that? Here he's defining evil. If we want to put it really succinctly, he's defining evil in contrast to something. Mainly, the Bible defines evil as forsaking God for something else. And there's a lot of different ways that we can do that. Another way to put it, evil is anything that is absent from and in place of the character and the will of God. Now, maybe a way that we could represent this, actually, I've commented on the t-shirt I'm wearing and talking with several of you tonight because it feels nice in here. It doesn't out there. And so a black t-shirt that has some polyester in it doesn't do well outside. And it's been very hot outside. Now, this is also, this is a newer shirt, but, like most of us guys, I have plenty of shirts that also have I've worn them for a while. They have some holes in them. Whenever I lived in New York City, my apartment, the closet was so shallow that just using a normal hanger, I didn't realize this until I got ready to move, that all of my shirts were rubbing against the sliding door over and over and over again. So every single one of them, whenever I moved, had this little hole in the shoulder of the shirt, right where the hanger was. And really, I think you could think of evil kind of like a hole in your shirt. Because what is a hole in your shirt? You could point at it, when you see a hole. It's very obvious, it's clear, it's definable, and yet what is a hole? It's not a thing. We understand what a hole is as the absence of a thing. It's the absence of the material. It's the absence of clothing. When we think of evil, evil is not, the Bible doesn't paint this dualistic picture of these two opposing forces that have both been around equally long, and sometimes one wins and sometimes the other wins, and they're just contrary to one another. No, the Bible starts off saying, in the beginning, God. And he was it. And when we see death and decay and disease and brokenness and all these things enter the world, it entered the world not as something that was part of God, but as something that was contrary to God, something that was absent from or contrary to the will and the character of God. It was like a hole in your shirt. This quote from C.S. Lewis, if you've read him, if you're interested in pursuing Christianity and you have questions about faith, Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis is a great place to start. He shares, you can be good for the mere sake of goodness. You cannot be bad for the mere sake of badness. You can do a kind action when you are not feeling kind and when it gives you no pleasure, simply because kindness is right. But no one ever did a cruel action simply because cruelty is wrong, only because cruelty was pleasant or useful to them. He says, in other words, badness cannot succeed even in being bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. And then this is what's always stuck to me about this quote. Badness is only spoiled goodness. And there must be something good first before it can be spoiled. We call sadism a sexual perversion, he says, but you must first have the idea of a normal sexuality before you can talk of its being perverted. And if you can see which is the perversion, because you can explain the perverted from the normal and cannot explain the normal from the perverted. And so Lewis's point, I think it makes sense to us. Evil can't stand alone as its own thing. It's defined by being contrary to the good thing. It is spoiled goodness. It's the hole in our shirt. And so this begs the question for us, if evil is what's contrary to a good thing, then how do we know what the good thing is? We've got to have the set standard for what's good if we're going to be able to know what is evil. And so what's the standard for making something good or evil? For example, regardless of cultural background, regardless of whether we grew up here in the 21st century or if we grew up in the East back before the Common Era, regardless of cultural background, it seems that people have very often throughout history despised murder. No one's a fan of murder, especially when it's directed at them, right? Not big fans of murder. We believe people shouldn't suffer, be discriminated against, or fail to receive their basic necessities. But an argument could be made that a naturalistic worldview, it commends these things. It commends these outcomes. The idea of natural selection, if you're familiar with it, it's predicated on death. And history has shown us that we often interpret what's best for us collectively through the broken lens of what we desire most personally. We need a standard. We need a standard of goodness that doesn't come from humanity, but does deeply value humanity in order to properly guide humanity toward flourishing and away from destruction. And this is how the Bible depicts God. If you're unfamiliar with the understanding of God and theology from Scripture, he's depicted as both loving and just simultaneously. Both righteous in character and patient towards those of us that have been created in his image, but have rebelled against him with sin. This biblical idea of God, it gives us all the mental furniture for understanding why we have this innate sense of good and evil inside of us, why we long for justice, and why we're heartbroken at any kind of suffering. God accounts for that. But this leads us to our question for the evening. If God exists, if that God that we're talking about exists, then why would he allow all this evil and suffering in the world? Historically, this has been called the problem of evil, and we can understand it from two different angles. First, there's what we would call the logical problem of evil, which is essentially arguing that Christianity or theism, just believing in God in general, it can't consistently hold its teachings on both the existence of God and the presence of evil. In his 1955 work, Evil and Omnipotence, J.L. Mackie, he summarized this logical argument this way, and it's pretty easy to follow. It's 3 points. One, God is omnipotent. That word means all-powerful, right? Second, God is omnibenevolent. He's all good. He's all-powerful, he's all good, and then point 3, evil exists. Because 3 is true, and 1 and 2 are integral parts of theism, J.L. Mackie concluded God can't exist. And that's really the simplicity of what it comes down to. This isn't a new argument. Going back all the way before the birth of Jesus, Epicurus made the same claim. He said that God either wishes to take away evils, and he's unable to, or he's able, but he's unwilling to, or he neither is willing nor able, or he's both willing and able. That's really all the options that we have. And Epicurus, he kind of brings all these options to a head. He says, if God is willing to take away evil, but he's unable, well, he's feeble. And that's not in accordance with the character of how we'd understand God or a God we'd want to follow. If God is able to take away evil, but he's unwilling to, then he's envious, which is equally and not a God that we want to follow. Now, if God is neither willing to take away evil, nor is he able to take away evil, then he's both envious and feeble, and he's just not God. And then finally, if he's both willing to take away evil and he's able to take away evil, which alone is what we would define as God, and Epicurus says, from what source then are evils, or why doesn't he remove them? So he leaves that question unsolved, but ultimately, that leads you to think that maybe this God doesn't exist. Essentially, the conclusion that they're making is the same. And maybe this is just a clearer way of saying it. Evil and suffering seems like it can't coexist alongside a good, all-powerful God. Maybe you've heard that argument articulated to you before. Maybe that's something that you yourself have or currently struggle with as well. That's the logical argument from evil. Now, on the other side of the coin, there's what we would call the evidential argument. And it takes a subtly different approach. It doesn't claim that God and evil cannot coexist, but it looks to the world around us, noting the presence of things like gratuitous evil, like disease in infants, or a deer that dies with no one knowing about it in the forest, that goes through suffering, things that don't seem to have any purpose, no discernible benefit. And the argument says that makes it likely that God doesn't exist because not all evil could have a purpose. Bart Ehrman, who is a professor of religious studies at UNC Chapel Hill and is a Duke fan, I'm already against the man, but he's done a lot of work on this topic. He summarizes the evidential argument well from his own experience. He grew up attending church, he considered himself a Christian, but he became an atheist as an adult after studying the problem of evil. And he says it this way: the God I once believed in was a God who is active in the world. And think about the Old Testament. He saved Israelites from slavery. He sent Jesus for the salvation of the world. He answered prayer. He intervened on behalf of his people when they were in desperate need. He was actively involved in my life, he says. But I can't believe in that God anymore, because from what I now see around the world, he doesn't intervene. Now, maybe you disagree with him on that, but that's something that I can certainly understand that point of view. So how should we approach this? How should we approach this very real challenge to believing in a good and loving God? I want to be charitable here because there's a couple of responses that maybe you've heard before or they've been given that they're awfully quickly thrown out, that someone skeptical toward Christianity might not find very convincing or even very loving. First, and maybe you've heard this before, someone might say that God just has a divine purpose or a sovereign plan. And that he has this plan for evil that we just can't understand. And someone skeptical about Christianity might acknowledge that, okay, well, I wouldn't know an infinite God's plan or his reasons for doing the things the way he does, but they could still point to gratuitous evil, like that poor little deer that fell into a trap in the woods and is just suffering and dying on his own, and say, okay, there's no purpose for that. It doesn't seem like there's purpose for everything in this world. But second, they might respond to the problem of evil and say evil simply exists because God created humanity with free will. And then we brought it onto ourselves. But that feels a little simplistic. And not just a little simplistic, it almost sounds like God chose a poor system for how he created us. That it would be so feeble that it could collapse just simply because we made some bad choices if it's caused so much failure and so much destruction. But the person that's skeptical to Christianity also just can't offer simple answers here. And maybe if you find yourself to that and you've kind of like, this is the thing that you put your flag in, why I can't believe in the biblical God, you might say that if God exists, he's just not all powerful. And so he's not able to eliminate suffering. But if that's the case, a finite God shouldn't be trusted or worshiped. That doesn't make sense. That's not the way the Bible depicts the Christian God, down to his victory and his death and his resurrection through Jesus. Or maybe God exists, but he's just not all good. Once again, that's not consistent with the witness of Scripture. Psalm 136:1, the Bible tells us, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. The Bible is very clear that God is all-powerful and that he's all-loving. And so we can't believe in the biblical God and simply remove those statements of faith. Go back to Genesis, and it's person number 3. Like we couldn't, and not just, before we got to 4 people, like, you're 4 people in, and a quarter of humanity was just eliminated. Like murder is a part of down to the very beginning of our history. We go 1, 2, they got married, 3, 4, death. Like it's always been with us. Or maybe like J.L. Mackie, Epicurus, Bart Ehrman, maybe you just conclude from the problem of evil that God doesn't exist. And maybe that's where you're tonight. But like we mentioned before, and I think if we're going to be honest with ourselves, and a term that I like that I got from another pastor, if we're going to be willing enough to doubt our own doubts, without the existence of God, you're back needing to find an objective source for good that can justify the presence of evil. The very thing you're saying exists that disproves God needs a God in order for it to exist. So, how does Christianity reconcile this challenge? How does Christianity reconcile the presence of evil and suffering with the existence of a good and all-powerful God? I'm going to state the answer 2 different ways. I'm going to state the answer simply and then philosophically. Since I know we're all wired differently, and those of us wanting the simple answer do not want to sit through the philosophical answer first, just so we can get everything summarized. Although you're going to see that the simple answer, it begs the question of the more thorough philosophical response, and I think we need both. Because first, the answer put simply, just because you don't know an answer doesn't mean there isn't an answer. If both a good and loving God exists as well as evil exists, then that God must have, and we're going to get into this, but that God must have a morally sufficient reason for allowing that evil. And you might not always see or understand what that reason is. If you've been married before, then you can acknowledge that this is possible. That just because something is done doesn't mean that you are going to know the reason. Or just because you know the reason doesn't mean you're going to understand the reason. But that doesn't mean that there was not a reason. Okay, that's probably not enough. The simple question begs the more complicated question. To several of you, that might just sound like a slightly wordier version of God has a plan. And that doesn't speak anything necessarily, or potentially, depending on where you're at tonight, that might not speak to your heart. And you're not wrong that it's why we also need the philosophical answer to help flesh this out. And so I want to give us 3 steps to get to this philosophical answer. First, we need to define what it means that God is all-powerful. And I would put it this way. The God of the Bible can do whatever is logically possible and not contradict his divine nature. Okay, what do I mean by that? Logically possible. God can't make a squared circle. Does that make sense? Because he created each shape as distinct. If God all of a sudden says, hey, I'm going to draw a circle this way, guess what? That's what a circle is now. By definition, he's changed the definition. So God can't make a squared circle. He has to do what is logically possible because he is the author of logic. But secondly, God also only functions and is able to function within his nature. God can't sin because sin and evil is defined in contrast to God, right? And so if God were to embrace something as sinful, all of a sudden it would, by definition, no longer be sinful. He can't do something that's not in his nature, just like we can't. Humans can't be dogs. Some weird places they might try to be, but they can't be. Like, we can't fly. You might try to be, only once. We can't. It's against our nature. So first, we got to define what it means that God's all-powerful. Second, with the definition of God as all-powerful in place, we need to acknowledge that no one, whether it's God or it's ourselves or it's someone else, no one can be held morally accountable for failing to do what they couldn't do or for doing what they couldn't fail to do. In other words, no one is morally accountable unless they act freely. Hold on to that because we're going to come back to that after point number 3. Third, regardless of how you understand how the world came into existence, and we might have various interpretations on that tonight, even among Christians, when God was there in creation, he had to choose between including in it either one or the other of two good but mutually contradictory things. And because the two goods are mutually contradictory, God couldn't include both because God cannot actualize a contradiction, right? Given our understanding of who God is and what it means that he's all powerful. So what were those two options? Option 1, remove all possibility of evil. Option 2, create non-glorified human beings in his image. Or to put it another way, create people specifically the way that he created us, with our distinctions, with our abilities, with our autonomy. If God had chosen to remove evil, he would have done something very good. I think we can all acknowledge that. If he chose to just remove all evil right from the onset or remove the possibility of evil, that would have been a good thing. Yet the option that God chose, creating us the way that we are, creating you the way that you are, distinctly, creatively, in his image, creating you, that is a value of such magnitude that it's at least as valuable as removing evil, which means God's done nothing morally wrong in his choice. Alvin Plantinga, in his book, God, Freedom, and Evil, says a good God will eliminate evil as far as he can without either losing a greater good or bringing about a greater evil. And that's the argument of the Bible. If you're wondering how the Bible relates to this, it says that God chose to put a value of the highest order into our world and did not do what he couldn't do. He didn't actualize a contradiction by simultaneously removing evil, which fulfills his moral obligation. He's a good God. John Feinberg, he's a professor emeritus now at the Biblical and Systematic Theology at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He was also influential for me just in understanding, kind of providing language around the problem of evil. He summarized it this way, and I know that we have a lot of quotes tonight. I think that this one helps kind of put a bow on this philosophical argument. He says, "It is my contention that if God did what is necessary to rid our world of moral evil," so what you think about it, it's nice and easy to say, like, okay, let's get rid of all evil. What would that take? What would that require for God to do for that to happen? If God did what's necessary to rid our world of moral evil, Feinberg says, he would either contradict his intentions to create a human being in the world as he has, he would cause us to wonder if he has one or more of the attributes ascribed to him, or do something we wouldn't expect or desire him to do because it would produce greater evil than there already is. The Christian understanding of God and evil, it's built on the belief that God did a good thing when he made us. God did a good thing when he made us as autonomous creatures bearing the marks of his personal creativity and freedom. We reflect Creator God in that. In other words, why would God allow evil and suffering in the world? Because God loves you. And you're worth it. Just the way that he made you in his image. Now, I don't want to sound flippant or dismissive of the weight behind this concern that people have believing in the God of the Bible, because Genesis 1:26, it tells us that God made man and woman in his image. And that image came with all of God's autonomy and creativity as he directed mankind to rule over his creation. But understand me here, because to understand how evil exists in our world now, linking back to the way that the Bible, all the way back in the book of Genesis, describes how he created man and woman and the directions that he gave them. When we chose When humanity chose in the freedom that God gave us as his image bearers to develop our own will and desires apart from him, our ability to bear his image developed a hole in our shirt. That's what we call sin, and it distorted the picture of God that was reflected by the people of God to all of the creation of God. So what was the result? The hole in the shirt that was wrongfully reflected spread to a hole in all of creation, wrongfully representing the good God that ordered it for all of us to enjoy. And so the childbearing now is painful. Bodies decay, natural disasters occur. All of this stems from the hole in humanity's shirt as we inaccurately reflected the nature of God as his broken image bearers. All of those things are connected. And so when we ask why God would allow such frequent evils and suffering throughout the world, the Bible affirms this reality of a broken creation. Throughout this summer, we're going to be in Romans chapter 8. And to fast forward in our Bible study to verses 18 through 23, Paul says in Romans chapter 8, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, because of him who subjected it, right? All of creation has been broken by sin. And then verse 21, he says, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but us. We ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly as we eagerly wait for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Let's make it a little practical here. Think of an underground railroad system. Regardless of how you feel about using public transportation, I'm a fan. I spent 5 years in New York, and I loved taxis, actually. I loved the subway. I only got punched once, and so it was relatively safe for me. I enjoyed taking public transit. But regardless of whether you have enjoyed it or not, and maybe you haven't experienced that before, maybe the streetcars in New Orleans is about the extent of what you've seen. But subway systems like the ones that run in New York, it's kind of incredible how many people they're able to transport in a day, in a given period of time. But in a major city like New York, so much of it comes down to a small thing behind the scenes. It comes down to their signal system. Their signal system it's tracking what trains are coming when, it's showing which ones need to go where, it's making sure that everything arrives on time, which, spoiler alert, it doesn't often do, because when the system breaks down, trains don't arrive on time, backups happen, Rob gets punched. This is kind of how we can think about, from the Christian perspective, the order of our world. The natural order of the world and everything in it is broken. We just read that in Romans 8. Just like a subway signal system, if one part of the interconnected whole of creation is not functioning as it was intended, the whole system breaks down. We were created, according to the Bible, not simply to give credit to God for his handiwork, but to reflect his divine goodness in unique and creative and distinct ways to one another and to all of creation. When we chose all the way going back to the garden, when we choose to create an identity that's unrooted from that design, and we reflect instead our own autonomous desires, our own self-interests, the entire system of creation fragments. Disease, decay, destruction, and suffering. But we can't finish our time this evening with just that conclusion. Because like I said at the beginning, even though the question, why would a good God allow evil and suffering in the world, even though that sounds like a rational objection, for most of us it's ultimately an emotional one. And maybe for people in your life right now, that's where they're at. And they don't want to, Feinberg's response to the philosophical problem of evil is these 3 steps. And that's not where people are at. So us justifying the possibility of God existing in all the world experiencing evil and suffering, just justifying it's not enough. We need to finish our time together, just for a couple of minutes, addressing our hearts. The Christian worldview, it neither minimizes nor really just lets go of the devastating reality of suffering. And it doesn't account it as entirely purposeless either. The late Tim Keller, who was a pastor in New York, and he ministered there until his death from pancreatic cancer a few years ago. He wrote an excellent book that I'd commend to you. It's called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. In one of the chapters, he offers a summary for how Christianity approaches suffering in a way that's altogether unique from every other world religion. He says that Christianity teaches that contra fatalism, suffering is overwhelming. Contra Buddhism, suffering is real. Contra karma, suffering is often unfair. But contra secularism, suffering is meaningful. There is a purpose to it, and if faced rightly, it can drive us like a nail deep into the love of God and into more stability and spiritual power than you can imagine. The sense of purpose in our midst of suffering, it begins with the gospel of Jesus. And that's the unique resource we have as believers. God the Father sending his Son to suffer in our place. It's the boldest statement in the argument concerning the problem of evil. Because though God, and you can read the Bible cover to cover, though God might not always explain the why for your suffering, in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus on your behalf, he's ultimately demonstrated that he cares. He's shown how much he cares. In the gospel, God demonstrates that his love for us as beings created in our image, it's a superior good over removing evil. He doesn't minimize our suffering, and he doesn't leave us to endure it alone. It would be easy, going back to Platinga, to see God as remote and detached, permitting all these evils, himself untouched, in order to achieve ends that are no doubt exalted, but have little to do with us and a little power to assuage our griefs. But Alvin Platinga, he makes this conclusion. He says it would be easy to see him as cold and unfeeling. But God, as Christians see him, is neither remote nor detached. His aims and goals may be beyond our ken. They may require our suffering. But God is himself prepared to accept much greater suffering in the pursuit of those needs. E. Stanley Jones put it this way: the cross is God sensitive to human sin and sorrow. So sensitive that it becomes his very own. The Christian worldview, it presents a God who is big enough to conquer big enough to conquer evil. He's good enough to want to. He's sacrificial enough to take our place. He's intelligent enough to have a plan for our ultimate flourishing, and he's loving enough to continue walking with us each new day. Now, this isn't meant to just put a bow on the question of God and evil in a way that prepares you to never doubt or struggle with suffering in the future. That was never the goal of this evening. But as we wrap up tonight, I do want to suggest two purposes that for the Christian that's placed their faith in Jesus that we can find in the midst of personal suffering. And because within the Christian worldview, suffering can produce community, and I believe it can produce character. So two things, and then we're done. First, regarding community. The quickest path to intimacy is vulnerability. Right? Think of a new romantic couple growing and deepening in their relationship as they start sharing their hopes and their dreams, and also then going along sharing their insecurities and their failures. The Christian worldview, it doesn't merely provide a path for individual purpose. It creates a community through shared experience in the rawness of communicating our own brokenness and our need and our failures and our struggles with pain when someone else is providing for us. And so suffering has the capacity within the Christian worldview to create deep community. Galatians 6:2 says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Our struggles in life, they reveal our need and provide opportunities for others to know and serve us. They set up a deep relationship that should be present and visible in every church community because we're regularly acknowledging our sin and need before a holy and loving God. But second, regarding character, and I think this is my last quote for the night. Origen, the 3rd century Greek scholar, he said, virtue is not virtue if it not be untested and unexamined. The hard things we go through in life, they provide the opportunity to refine us as we look to Jesus rather than ourselves as our true and unchanging source of strength. 1 Peter 1:6-7. Peter says, in this you rejoice. Though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials. He's speaking to people that are being burned as candles outside of Emperor Nero's And he says, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it's tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Remember when God promises he will be with you in your struggles, and there are so many scriptures that speak exactly to that. The cross of Jesus, when he makes that promise, the cross of Jesus shows you how far he's willing to go to keep that promise. And because that's the promise of the cross, and the cross is the central event of our faith and our justification before God, any Christian discussion of evil must always begin and end there. If the cross shows us God's love for us in the midst of our sin against him, then following after Jesus will naturally lead us to be present with others as they go through their own suffering and their own difficulties in life. Perhaps some of you this evening, whether it's you yourself or you know someone, you're dealing with something challenging in your life right now. Our church desires to be a community that doesn't just communicate ideas to each other, but one that cares. We want to know how we can serve you in the days ahead. You can text this number. You can talk to any of the people that are wearing one of the colorful lanyards here tonight, even if they take it off as I'm saying it. You'll probably still notice. You can still talk to them. But as we talk about a question like this, the goal is not that, okay, we've covered that, it's done, we're good. Again, I could take this example back to marriage. And you can have a conversation about something. You can understand your spouse's heart. You can understand their reasoning, or you can at least hear it, and you're processing it. And then the same thing happens again. And you're like, oh, well, I thought I understood this, but now here we are again. And so you share again. And maybe you understand it a little bit differently. And just like the disco ball that's spinning above our heads, every single day is a new opportunity where our lives reflect a new aspect of our need for God and show the ways that he's provided through Jesus Christ. It gives us deeper paths into intimacy with him, which gives us the resources we need to face the challenges in life and to be present with those that go through the same thing. I want to pray for us, and then at that point, we'll transition as we wrap up our night. Father, thank you for the presence of your word. Thank you for providing clarity around who you are. Lord, if we just simply knew that there is a God, and that God made us, and that God tells us what to do and not to do, we would live our lives in fear, shame, concern over what happens if we don't do it right, concern over whether or not you actually care, or what you would do if we get things wrong. But it's your word that says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Lord, it's your word, and we can look to examples even in the Old Testament where you redeemed your people before you even gave them your law. You're a God who creates, and you're a God who saves, and you're a God that has shown your love. Lord, even if we don't have answers for why we might be going through things right now, you've shown that whatever the reason might be, it can't be because you don't care, because you've shown us how much you've cared in sending your Son to suffer in our place, to die on our behalf, that we might be reconciled to you and might be called children of God. Lord, may you not just encourage us and give us peace in our own hearts through that truth tonight, but may you equip us to be able to be peacemakers with others as we share the good news of Jesus. We pray in his name. Amen.